How are you going to decide how to vote in the EU referendum? And is it in fact possible to predict how you're going to vote based on where you live, what you earn, and when you finished your education? Here's Giles.
Norwich used to be the second city of medieval England, its prosperity built on the wool trade with Europe. It may have lost that lofty status today, but with the EU referendum, the question of its relationship with the European Union is more relevant than ever. This is St Martin's Road in Norwich North. Now, if I just walk a few metres down towards Oak Street, I'm heading towards Norwich South. Now, of course, there's no boundary, there's no border, it's just Norwich. But there are constituency boundaries, and a body of work has been done that suggests the more I walk this way, the more likely I am to vote to stay in the EU. Why this might be true is not an exact science, but based on data from around Britain, a group of academics have tried to show who we are. Our background and education is not insignificant in this referendum process.
We know that older people are more likely to want to leave, more educated people are more likely to want to stay. And so if you're looking at some of the constituency profiles, you can say, yes, this place probably is going to be more leaning towards Remain or more leaning towards Leave. And that's all we're doing. We're just giving a guide to the seats which are more or less Eurosceptic.
Norwich North's Conservative MP is for Remain, but she's aware the population of her constituency is such that many may not share her view. Indeed, according to the model, they're far more likely not to.
It is a slightly older constituency, that's there in the statistics. It is, sad to say actually, slightly earning less on average wages, very slightly less than the city centre area. However, actually we have higher employment rates, so that perhaps starts to give you a picture of the kind of place that Norwich North is compared to Norwich South if you looked at statistics.
Later we caught up with two self-employed men buying timber, having driven to a yard on the constituency boundary.
Turn my hand to anything, gardening, building, all sorts.
For Darren and Adrian, the referendum choice is firmly made.
The EU has done nothing for anybody in this country, only the rich.
Well, I ain't benefited even, I can't say that anyone's benefited around here for being in Europe,
We can cross-ventilate because it'll come in and go straight up. Because
in Norwich South, the university has an enterprise zone. At one business specialising in low-energy house design, the graduate-educated founder wants to remain for what she sees as the consistent and long-term goals of EU environmental policy. She accepts the theory, though, that who you are does play a role.
People that have maybe knowledge about something and that is affected either by in or out of the EU, they are better qualified, or maybe it's easier for them to make a decision because it's clearer to them, because there's something really big that matters to them that they can base their decision upon.
So I came in as a building site.
Labour's MP in Norwich South is, as the model suggests most of his constituency are, for Remain. And he thinks deprived areas that are for Leave are anti-establishment more than they're anti-EU.
People who feel left behind, who feel that the political system has failed them, can identify with that and can identify with the arguments of coming out of the EU, which for them is something which sucks lots of money out of the country, does nothing for them practically. What has the EU ever done for me? And we can list all of that, but it's a visceral feeling.
I read papers, but I don't honestly know what's going on. I don't.
That visceral feeling comes across on the shop floor at Milltech outside Norwich.
I want to be British. That's my main incentive, to be British. I don't want people to call me European. I want to be British.
But the firm has reasons to remain for what they see as economic reasons, and that might be key.
Work is probably the biggest part of my life in terms of where I spend most of my time, so that would probably be the biggest thing to sway me.
Indeed, whatever the data trends, sometimes the what's best for you vote is perhaps the only incentive that really adds up.
Giles Dill not reporting there. Well, David Blunkett and Dominic Raab are still here with me, and we've been joined now by Bert Bakker, Assistant Professor of Political Communication at the University of Amsterdam, who's been looking at what impact different types of personality have on attitudes towards the EU. Welcome to the programme. What's your research found?
So my research is about the question to what extent individual differences in personality traits are associated with your beliefs about politics. And perhaps it's best to briefly say what personality then actually is, because you and your viewers at home are forming an opinion about me. They might say, well, he is shy or very talkative. And what we do when we're studying personality traits, we see to what extent people differ in these descriptions. And they cluster along dimensions. So some people are more open-minded. They're curious, imaginative, while others are less open-minded. They are more dogmatic, a little bit less rich of fantasy. And these differences are not good or bad, but people differ, and they shape how you respond to the world. It shapes your behavior in the work-life balance, right, or in your work, but it also shapes your beliefs about politics.
Right. So, well, in that instance, what sort of person would vote to leave the EU, do you think?
So what we are, in the study that we've done, that was published recently, we studied Dutch voters, and we studied their attitudes towards different aspects of the EU. And so it's slightly different than voting, but what we see is that people who, for instance, are in favor of expanding the EU by adding more countries such as Iceland, Turkey, Montenegro, are more open-minded, more curious. They are also a bit more agreeable, so they're more trusting, caring, tender-minded. This is not, these beliefs are not per se directly one-on-one leading to voting for in the UK case, staying in the EU, but they are associated with it. So we have been looking at attitudes, but they could, if you're for expanding the EU, there is, if I'm extrapolating my own research a little bit, there's probably a chance that these open-minded, curious, people who are full of fantasy are also a little bit more likely to be in favor of remaining in the EU.
So what about anti-EU sentiment?
Well, it's then the opposite. So it's the other end of the dimension. So people who are a bit more, and I'm here not to make a value judgment. So these people are a little bit more close-minded, a little bit more rigid, perhaps a little bit less full of fantasy, a bit less likely to trust other people. Again, like, these are correlations, so we don't know whether the one is causing the other, but there's an association between your psychological setup and your beliefs about politics. All right,
stay with us. So, the obvious question, are you rigid, less full of fantasy, Dominic Raab, as somebody who is against staying in the EU?
So you know how open-minded I am, which shows you how risky it is to introduce these stereotypes. I think particularly in relation to undecided voters, there's a mixture of head and heart. So, for example, I mean, funnily enough, I did take a very rational, logical approach to this. I'm not someone that was always in favour of leaving the EU, but the thing that clinched it for me was the emotional heart aspect of it. I want us to be in control of our own destiny. And in particular, it feels to me that those campaigning to leave the EU have got the optimism and the ambition, whereas those campaigning to stay in the EU, frankly, are engaged in a lot of scaremongering and doing down Britain. And I think on the emotional pull factor, that's quite an important thing we've got on our side.
Right. If we look, though, at campaigning tactics, David Blunkett, and if you look at what was said in the film by people there, one of the contributors said, I want to feel British again, and leaving the EU will satisfy that. The employers of one of the companies there keener to stay in because of economics. Does this help in terms of targeting areas of the country and groups of people in terms of how they might vote because of their age or where they live?
Well, we certainly know that young people are more favourable to staying in, partly because many young people have travelled, many young people have ambition for their own future, and they feel that they're engaged in global activity. Whereas for older people whose travel experience may have been less, not wholly, but may have been less, where fear of difference, where fear of the unknown, where somebody outside appears to be imposing, then it's not surprising that there's a greater propensity to vote to come out. So here's the challenge. For the Stay In campaign, of which I'm a part, how do we persuade young people who don't usually vote to vote, And how do we persuade those who do normally vote, older people, to switch their vote? And that's why it's on a knife edge.
Right.
Because that's such a challenge.
Well, Bert Bakker, have you got any advice for the two campaigns? Where should they be targeting the areas that perhaps they are not making an impact in terms of age and demography?
Okay, so this is moving beyond the study that we have done and extrapolating the findings a little bit. But one could say that that politicians perhaps could benefit from speaking what we then call the psychological language of their constituency. So they might appeal to certain to certain people by, for instance, if you wanna persuade perhaps voters who are a bit more open-minded, curious, full of fantasy, who like to experience new things, you might point out that staying within the EU offers them the opportunity to enrich in his rich cultural life, to be engaged, to engage with new cultures, to be a part of all that. I have not tested this, so I have to be very careful here. Like this is a.
Well, thank you for clarifying that, at least.
Yeah.
All right, listen, Bert Bakker, thank you very much for that, and to you, Dominic Raff. Now,